The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Preston's Fine Dining, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. The warm glow of crystal chandeliers reflected off polished silverware as guests chatted softly over their meals. Behind the host station stood Mrs. Lee, a woman in her mid-50s who had turned welcoming guests into her personal domain over the past 15 years. She took immense pride in her position, considering herself the gatekeeper of the restaurant's elite atmosphere. Her carefully styled gray-streaked hair and pressed uniform spoke of someone who paid attention to every detail. Throughout her years of service, she had developed what she called a sixth sense about which guests belonged and which didn't, a sense that, unknown to her, was deeply rooted in prejudice rather than any real insight. The dinner rush was in full swing when Dr. Anderson Thompson walked in. He had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at City General Hospital, where he'd successfully completed 2 complex heart surgeries. Still wearing his casual clothes, a simple blue polo shirt and khaki pants, he looked nothing like what most people expected of a renowned cardiothoracic surgeon. His watch, a cherished gift from his late father, was the only hint of luxury about him. The moment he stepped through the door, Mrs. Lee's welcoming smile faltered. Her eyes darted from his casual attire to his dark skin, and her expression shifted from professional courtesy to poorly concealed disdain. She watched as he took in the restaurant's elegant decor, noting how several tables sat empty, their white tablecloths pristine and waiting for guests. "Good evening," Dr. Thompson said warmly, his voice carrying the gentle confidence of someone used to putting others at ease. "I'd like a table for one, please." The long day of saving lives had left him craving a quiet meal and a glass of good wine. Mrs. Lee's fingers tightened around her reservation book. She glanced at the clearly visible empty tables before looking back at Dr. Thompson. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice dripping with false regret, "but we're fully booked for the evening." She emphasized each word as if speaking to someone who might have trouble understanding. A couple walked in behind Dr. Thompson at that moment, both wearing business attire. Mrs. Lee's face brightened immediately. "Good evening," she called out past him. "Table for 2? Right this way, please." The couple exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly noticing the interaction. The woman opened her mouth as if to say something, but her partner gently pulled her along, not wanting to get involved. Dr. Thompson stood there, his expression calm, but his eyes reflecting a weariness that came from facing such situations far too many times in his life. "I can see several empty tables from here," he said quietly, maintaining his composure, "and I'm happy to wait if there are reservations." Mrs. Lee's lips pressed into a thin line. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the restaurants downtown," she suggested, her tone making it clear what kind of establishments she meant. "We have certain standards here at Preston's." She straightened her spine, wielding her authority like a shield. What Mrs. Lee didn't notice was a petite Asian woman sitting at a corner table who had stopped eating and was watching the scene unfold with growing disbelief. Mrs. Chen, the hospital's chief administrator, had seen Dr. Thompson perform miracles in the operating room countless times. Just 3 months ago, she had watched him work for 14 hours straight to save her father's life when every other surgeon had deemed the case hopeless. The story was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would shake Mrs. Lee's world to its very foundation. But in this moment, she stood firm in her prejudice, unaware that her actions would soon lead to consequences that would change not only her life, but the lives of those around her in ways she could never have imagined. The tension in the restaurant's elegant entrance grew thicker with each passing moment. Other diners had begun to notice the scene unfolding at the host station, their conversations dropping to whispers as they watched. The soft classical music playing in the background seemed to fade away, replaced by the weight of uncomfortable silence. Dr. Thompson stood there, his shoulders straight but relaxed, showing the same patience he often used when explaining complex procedures to worried families. He'd faced situations like this before, though each time still stung. His hands were the same ones that had delicately repaired countless hearts, saved numerous lives just hours ago, yet here he was, being judged not by his character or achievements, but by his appearance. "I can wait," he said calmly, gesturing to the empty seats in the waiting area. "If these tables are reserved, I'm happy to sit until one becomes available." His voice remained steady, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. Mrs. Lee's discomfort seemed to grow with his persistence. She shuffled the reservation book in her hands, flipping pages unnecessarily. "I've already explained that we're fully committed this evening," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Perhaps you don't understand what I'm saying. We have a certain clientele here." A few tables away, an elderly couple stopped eating, the wife placing her fork down with a quiet but deliberate clink against her plate. At another table, a young business executive in an expensive suit looked up from his phone, frowning at the scene. "I understand perfectly," Dr. Thompson replied, his tone remaining professional. "I understand that there are at least 6 empty tables visible from where I'm standing. I understand that you just seated a couple who walked in after me. And I understand exactly what you mean by certain clientele." Mrs. Lee's face flushed red. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not so calmly and logically. "Sir," she said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound anything but respectful, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The young business executive stood up from his table, apparently ready to intervene, but before he could take a step, another voice cut through the tension. "Dr. Thompson." The voice belonged to Mrs. Chen, who had been watching the entire interaction from her corner table. She stood up, her small frame carrying an unmistakable air of authority. "I thought that was you." Mrs. Lee watched in confusion as Mrs. Chen approached, her designer handbag swinging from her arm, her heels clicking purposefully against the hardwood floor. The restaurant's other patrons turned to watch this new development, many of them grateful for someone finally stepping in. "I can't believe the coincidence," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent restaurant. "I was just telling my dinner companion about the incredible surgery you performed this morning. 12 hours in the operating room, wasn't it? 2 lives saved before most people had even finished their morning coffee." Mrs. Lee's expression began to shift, the color draining from her face as she realized something was very wrong with her assessment of the situation. She gripped her reservation book tighter, her knuckles turning white. "The hospital board was just discussing your latest research publication," Mrs. Chen went on, now standing beside Dr. Thompson. "Groundbreaking work on minimally invasive cardiac procedures. Though I suppose that's just another day at the office for one of the country's leading heart surgeons." Other diners were now openly staring at Mrs. Lee, their expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. The elderly couple who had stopped eating earlier shook their heads sadly. The business executive who had been about to intervene sat back down, but kept watching intently. Mrs. Lee's world seemed to be spinning. The man she had been trying so desperately to turn away, the man she had deemed unsuitable for her precious restaurant, was one of the city's most respected doctors. She opened and closed her mouth several times, but no words came out. "I believe my friend here was asking for a table," Mrs. Chen said, her polite tone carrying an edge of steel. "Unless, of course, you prefer I call Mr. Preston directly. I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear about how his restaurant treats distinguished medical professionals." The mention of the owner's name seemed to break through Mrs. Lee's shocked stupor. But before she could respond, before she could try to backtrack or make excuses, she had no idea that this moment would lead to even more shocking revelations, ones that would force her to confront her prejudices in ways she never expected. Mrs. Chen drew herself up to her full height, which even in heels wasn't particularly imposing, but her presence filled the restaurant's entrance. As the hospital's chief administrator, she had witnessed countless moments of both triumph and tragedy, but this situation struck a particularly personal chord. "You know," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed restaurant, 3 months ago, I sat in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning. My father had suffered a massive heart attack, and every surgeon we consulted said operating would be too risky." She paused, her eyes growing distant with the memory. The other diners were completely captivated now. Even the servers had stopped moving, water pitchers and plates held motionless as they listened. Mrs. Lee stood frozen behind her podium, the reservation book still clutched in her trembling hands. "But Dr. Thompson," Mrs. Chen continued, gesturing to the man beside her, "he didn't just see another hopeless case. He saw my father, a real person with a family who loved him. He spent hours studying my father's case, developing a new surgical approach that could work with Dad's unique condition. She turned to face Dr. Thompson, her eyes filling with tears that she quickly blinked away. The surgery lasted 14 hours. 14 hours during which this man didn't take a single break. He stood there, saving my father's life, while most people were going about their regular day, complaining about traffic or long lines at coffee shops. The elderly couple who had been watching earlier dabbed at their eyes with their napkins. A young waitress in the corner was openly crying, trying to hide it behind her serving tray. "And do you know what Dr. Thompson did after the surgery?" Mrs. Chen asked, looking directly at Mrs. Lee now. "He sat with my family for an hour, explaining everything in terms we could understand, making sure we knew exactly how to help Dad recover. He gave us his personal phone number in case we had questions. He even visited Dad during his rounds on his days off." Dr. Thompson looked slightly embarrassed at the praise, shuffling his feet modestly. "Anyone would have done the same," he said quietly. "No," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Not anyone. Not everyone would have seen the possibility of success where others saw only failure. Not everyone would have spent their free time researching new surgical techniques just to save one life. Not everyone would have shown such compassion and dedication." She turned back to Mrs. Lee, whose face had grown increasingly pale. "And this is just one story. Do you know how many lives he's saved? How many families still have their loved ones because of him? Just last week, he performed a groundbreaking surgery that's being written about in medical journals. There's a reason our hospital has one of the highest success rates for cardiac surgery in the country." The business executive who had almost intervened earlier spoke up from his table. "Wait a minute, Dr. Thompson. Are you the surgeon who developed the new minimally invasive technique for valve replacement? My mother's scheduled for that surgery next month." Before Dr. Thompson could respond, another diner chimed in. "My cousin had heart surgery at City General last year. The doctor was so kind and patient. Was that you?" More voices joined in, sharing stories of encounters with Dr. Thompson or the hospital. The restaurant had transformed from a place of uncomfortable silence to one buzzing with connections and realizations. Mrs. Lee's world was crumbling around her. Each story, each revelation, hit her like a physical blow. The man she had tried to turn away had touched so many lives, saved so many people, and so much respect, and she had judged him solely based on his appearance. But the true impact of her prejudice was about to hit even closer to home. As she stood there, growing increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment, she had no idea that the next revelation would shake her to her very core. The connection between Dr. Thompson and her own family was about to emerge, and it would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her carefully maintained worldview. The atmosphere in the restaurant had completely transformed. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had turned into something like a town hall meeting, with diners sharing their connections to Dr. Thompson and City General Hospital. The crystal chandeliers seemed to sparkle more brightly as the energy in the room shifted from tension to admiration. "Just last month," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice carrying authority that came from years of hospital administration, Dr. Thompson made headlines when he successfully performed a heart transplant that other surgeons had deemed impossible. The patient had been told to get their affairs in order, that nothing could be done. She paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. Mrs. Lee's hands had begun to shake so badly that she had to put down her reservation book. The leather-bound volume made a soft thud as it hit the podium, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, connecting dots she hadn't even known existed. "Impossible," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "A heart transplant last month." Dr. Thompson nodded quietly, still maintaining his professional composure. The patient had a rare condition that made the surgery extremely risky. But sometimes, when you look hard enough, you can find a way forward that others might have missed. Mrs. Lee's face had gone from pale to ashen, her legs felt weak, and she had to grip the podium for support. Was this at City General? The patient, was it a middle-aged man? The restaurant had gone quiet again, sensing another revelation approaching. Even the kitchen staff had poked their heads out, drawn by the mounting tension in the dining room. "Yes," Dr. Thompson replied, studying Mrs. Lee's face carefully. The patient had been turned down by 3 other hospitals. His case was particularly complex because of an unusual heart rhythm condition. Mrs. Lee's knees buckled slightly, and a young server quickly pushed a chair behind her. She sank into it, her perfectly pressed uniform wrinkling as she collapsed into the seat. "That was my brother," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My younger brother." The revelation rippled through the restaurant like a shockwave. Diners exchanged glances, some covering their mouths in surprise. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened as she looked between Mrs. Lee and Dr. Thompson. "The surgery is scheduled for next week," Mrs. Lee continued, her voice trembling. "My brother, he was so excited when he got the call. He said a brilliant surgeon had reviewed his case, found a way to make it work. He said it was like winning the lottery, getting the best heart surgeon in the city to take his case." Dr. Thompson's expression softened with recognition. "Mr. Lee. Of course. He has the same kind eyes as you, despite everything he's been through. He showed me pictures of his family during our consultation. He was particularly proud of his sister who, as he said, had worked her way up to become the face of one of the city's finest restaurants." Tears began rolling down Mrs. Lee's cheeks, smearing her carefully applied makeup. The proud, prejudiced facade she had maintained for so many years crumbled completely as the full impact of her actions hit her. "All this time," she said, her voice breaking, "all these years of judging people, of thinking I could tell someone's worth by how they looked or dressed, and the man I tried to turn away, the man I thought wasn't good enough for this restaurant, is the same person my brother has been calling his guardian angel." The elderly couple who had been watching everything unfold were openly crying now. The business executive who had recognized Dr. Thompson's name had moved closer, standing near the group with an expression of amazement on his face. "Your brother is a fighter," Dr. Thompson said gently. "During our consultations, he never lost hope, even when discussing the risks. He talked about his family, about how much he wanted to be there for his grandchildren's graduations. That kind of spirit, that will to live, it's just as important as any surgical skill." Mrs. Lee looked up at him, tears still streaming down her face. I don't know how to," she started, but words failed her. The weight of her actions, the irony of her prejudice, seemed to physically press down on her shoulders. But this moment of revelation, as powerful as it was just the beginning. The next few hours would bring even more changes as the ripples of this encounter spread through the restaurant, the hospital, and beyond. Mrs. Lee's world had been turned upside down, and the journey of transformation that lay ahead would impact far more lives than she could imagine. The evening had grown late, but nobody in Preston's fine dining seemed to notice or care about the time. The regular dinner service had practically come to a standstill as the drama continued to unfold. In a quiet corner of the restaurant, Mrs. Lee sat at a table with Dr. Thompson and Mrs. Chen, her hands wrapped around an untouched glass of water. "My brother," she began, her voice still shaky, "he's been sick for so long. Every doctor we saw gave us the same answer, that his condition was too complicated, too risky to operate on." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. "We started planning for the worst. He even began writing letters to his grandchildren to be opened on their future birthdays." Dr. Thompson listened quietly, his expression compassionate. The same patience he showed in examining complex medical cases was now focused on this unexpected personal situation. "I remember the day he called me," Mrs. Lee continued, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "He was crying, but for the first time in years, they were happy tears. He said a doctor at City General had reviewed his case and found a way to help him. He said this doctor spent hours explaining everything, drawing diagrams, answering all his questions." Several nearby tables were still listening, caught up in the unfolding story. A young couple who had just arrived for a late dinner sat quietly at their table, their menus untouched as they watched the scene. "The way my brother described you," Mrs. Lee looked at Dr. Thompson, her voice thick with emotion. "He said you were like a gift from heaven. He called you a miracle worker. And her voice broke, "I just tried to throw you out of this restaurant because of the color of your skin." The shame in her voice was palpable. The restaurant's soft lighting seemed to highlight the tears tracking down her cheeks, smearing what remained of her makeup. "Your brother showed me pictures of his grandchildren during our consultation," Dr. Thompson said gently. "He told me about the youngest one, just starting kindergarten, how she loves to dance and wants to be a doctor when she grows up." He smiled softly at the memory. "That's why I spent so much time reviewing his case. Every patient is someone's loved one, someone's whole world. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and squeezed Mrs. Lee's hand. That's who Dr. Thompson is, she said quietly. He doesn't see just patients or conditions. He sees people, families, hopes, and dreams. Next week, Mrs. Lee whispered, you'll be operating on my brother. You'll literally hold his heart in your hands. And tonight I treated you like... She couldn't finish the sentence, overcome with emotion. A server approached their table cautiously, carrying a tray with fresh tea. She had been crying too, her eyes red-rimmed as she carefully set down the cups. On the house, she said softly, before quickly retreating. The surgery, Mrs. Lee suddenly looked up, panic crossing her face. After how I treated you, will you still? Dr. Thompson held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Your brother's surgery will proceed exactly as planned, he said firmly. What happened here tonight has no bearing on that. I took an oath to help people, and I never let personal matters interfere with patient care. Relief flooded Mrs. Lee's face, followed immediately by a fresh wave of shame at having even questioned his professionalism. The contrast between his character and her own behavior seemed to hit her anew. But how? She struggled to find the words. How can you be so kind after the way I treated you? Dr. Thompson was quiet for a moment, considering his response. In my years of practice, I've learned something important, he finally said. Hatred and prejudice often come from fear and ignorance. The best way to fight them isn't with more negativity, but with understanding and compassion. Mrs. Chen nodded in agreement. I've watched Dr. Thompson handle difficult situations at the hospital many times. Whether it's a challenging surgery or a difficult patient, he always maintains his professionalism and humanity. The restaurant had grown quieter as more people listened to the conversation. Even the kitchen staff had slowed their work, drawn by the powerful moment unfolding in their dining room. But this isn't just about next week's surgery, Mrs. Lee said, her voice stronger now. This is about years, decades, of judging people based on nothing but appearances. How many other wonderful people have I turned away? How many connections have I missed? How many friendships never had the chance to form? The weight of her realization seemed to physically age her. The proud, prejudiced hostess who had stood so confidently at her podium earlier was gone, replaced by someone who was seeing the world, and herself, in a completely new light. Little did she know, this evening of revelations was far from over. The next few hours would bring even more changes, as word of the incident spread through the restaurant's management and beyond. Her journey of transformation was just beginning, and its ripples would affect not just her life, but the lives of many others in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Word of what had happened spread through Preston's fine dining like wildfire. The kitchen staff whispered about it over steaming pots, servers discussed it while folding napkins, and even the parking attendants had heard the story by the time the evening shift changed. But it wasn't just the restaurant staff who were talking. In the modern age of smartphones and social media, several diners had quietly recorded parts of the interaction. Not for viral fame or public shaming, but because they recognized the importance of what they were witnessing. A moment of truth that needed to be remembered. Around 9:30 p.m., Mr. Preston himself walked through the restaurant's grand entrance. The owner was a tall man in his 60s, with kind eyes and silver hair, who rarely visited during dinner service. But tonight was different. He received multiple calls from regular customers, each sharing their own version of what had transpired. The dining room fell silent as he made his way to the corner table where Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Chen, and Mrs. Lee still sat. His face was grave, but his steps were measured and calm. Mrs. Lee saw him approaching and tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Please, remain seated, Mr. Preston said softly, pulling up a chair to join them. He looked at each person at the table in turn, his gaze lingering on Dr. Thompson. First and foremost, Dr. Thompson, I want to offer my deepest personal apologies for what happened here tonight. This is not what Preston stands for. This is not what I stand for. Dr. Thompson nodded graciously, but before he could speak, Mr. Preston continued. My wife had heart surgery at City General last year. Different surgeon, but I know the incredible work you all do there. The idea that anyone would be treated with disrespect in my restaurant, let alone someone who dedicates their life to saving others. He shook his head, clearly disturbed. Mrs. Lee's hands trembled in her lap. Mr. Preston, He held up a hand, gently but firmly stopping her. Mrs. Lee, you've worked here for 15 years. In all that time, I've received countless compliments about your professional demeanor, your attention to detail, your ability to make our regular customers feel special. He paused, his expression growing more serious. But there have been other incidents, haven't there? Complaints I didn't want to believe. Reports I dismissed as misunderstandings. The truth hung heavy in the air. Several servers nearby looked down at their feet, remembering times they'd witnessed similar behavior but hadn't spoken up. We've found older complaints in our records, Mr. Preston continued. Times when minority guests were told we were full, only to watch other parties be seated immediately after. Instances when certain customers were consistently given the less desirable tables or faced longer wait times for service. Mrs. Lee's face crumpled. She couldn't deny it. These weren't isolated incidents, but a pattern of behavior she'd hidden behind a mask of professionalism. I've already spoken with our legal team and our HR department, Mr. Preston said. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full investigation. His voice was firm but not unkind. Additionally, we will be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff members, from the parking attendants to the executive chef. A young server stepped forward, gathering her courage. Mr. Preston, I think that's really good. I've seen things sometimes, but I was afraid to speak up. Maybe with proper training, we could all learn to be better. Other staff members nodded in agreement. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted from tension to something more hopeful, a sense that real change might be possible. Furthermore, Mr. Preston continued, I'd like to establish a scholarship program for minority students interested in culinary arts and restaurant management. Dr. Thompson, Mrs. Chen, I'd be honored if you both consider serving on the selection committee. Dr. Thompson looked surprised but pleased. That's a wonderful idea. Education and opportunity are powerful tools against prejudice. Mrs. Chen agreed. Sometimes the best way to fight discrimination is to open doors that were previously closed. Throughout all this, Mrs. Lee sat quietly, tears rolling down her cheeks. The consequences of her actions were real and significant, but somehow watching her workplace transform into something better helped ease the sting of her suspension. I understand why this has to happen, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I deserve this, but may I ask one favor? She looked at Mr. Preston pleadingly. Could I come back after my brother's surgery? After the training? I want to be part of the change. I want to make things right. Mr. Preston exchanged glances with Dr. Thompson and Mrs. Chen. That will depend on many factors, including your commitment to change and the findings of our investigation. But the fact that you're asking that question instead of making excuses, that's a start. As the evening drew to a close, the restaurant had been transformed, not just by the events that had unfolded, but by the promise of what was to come. Yet even as the last customers left and the staff began their closing duties, no one realized that the most profound changes were still to come. Mrs. Lee's journey of transformation was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and others. 3 months had passed since that fateful evening at Preston's Fine Dining. The early morning sun streamed through the windows of City General Hospital's cardiac wing as Mrs. Lee walked slowly down the corridor. Her steps were different now, less proud, more thoughtful. She carried a small photo album under her arm, and her face showed signs of someone who had done a lot of soul-searching. The hospital's walls were lined with photographs of successful surgeries and recovered patients. Mrs. Lee stopped at each one, studying the faces, seeing not just patients but whole stories, families, dreams, and second chances. She thought about how many times she'd walked past similar faces in her restaurant, making snap judgments without knowing their stories. She found Dr. Thompson in his office, reviewing patient files. The past 3 months had been busy for him, not just with surgeries, including her brother's successful operation, but also with the new community outreach programs he'd helped establish at Preston's. Dr. Thompson, she said softly, knocking on the open door. Do you have a moment? He looked up and smiled warmly, gesturing to a chair. The office was modest, with medical journals stacked neatly on the desk and children's drawings from grateful patients' families pinned to a bulletin board. My brother's doing wonderfully, she began, sitting down carefully. He's back to playing with his grandchildren. Yesterday, he even danced at his granddaughter's school recital. Her voice cracked slightly. Something he thought he'd never live to see. Dr. Thompson nodded, his eyes kind. His recovery has been remarkable. His spirit and determination played a big part in that. Mrs. Lee opened the photo album she brought. I wanted to show you something. These are pictures from the community center where I've been volunteering. She turned the pages slowly, revealing photos of her serving meals at a soup kitchen, helping at a free health clinic, tutoring children after school. After my suspension, I had a lot of time to think, she continued. I realized that breaking down prejudice isn't just about attending training sessions or saying the right things. It's about putting yourself in situations where you can really see people, really know them. The photos showed a diverse group of people, volunteers and those being helped, all working together, sharing meals, laughing, and learning from each other. In each picture, Mrs. Lee's smile became more genuine, more natural. The first few weeks were hard, she admitted. I kept catching myself making assumptions about people. But then I started listening to their stories. The single mother working 3 jobs to put her kids through college. The elderly man who used to be a professor in his home country but now can't get his credentials recognized. The teenager who walks 2 hours each way to attend a better school. Dr. Thompson listened intently, recognizing the genuine change in her voice and demeanor. You know what I discovered? She continued, her eyes welling up with tears. That everyone has a story worth hearing. Everyone has dreams worth respecting. And the barriers we put up, the judgments we make, they don't just hurt others, they make our own world smaller. She turned to the last page of the album, showing a group photo from a community celebration. Last week, we organized a multicultural food festival at the center. People brought dishes from their home countries, shared their traditions. And there I was, the former gatekeeper of an exclusive restaurant, learning how to make authentic dumplings from a Chinese grandmother and spicy curry from an Indian college student. Dr. Thompson smiled. That sounds wonderful. It was, she nodded. And you know what? The connections we made, the joy we shared, it was more genuine than anything I ever experienced in all my years of working at that fine restaurant. She emphasized the word fine with a touch of irony. Mr. Preston called me yesterday, she said after a pause. The mandatory training program at the restaurant has been going well. He asked if I'd be willing to come back, not as a hostess, but to help implement their new community outreach programs, to share what I've learned. And will you? Dr. Thompson asked. Mrs. Lee straightened in her chair. I told him yes, but with one condition, that we partner with local community centers to provide job training and opportunities for people who might not otherwise get them. No more gatekeeping, no more judgments, just open doors and fair chances. She stood up, gathering her album. But before I start, I wanted to thank you. Not just for saving my brother's life, but for showing me through your actions what true dignity looks like, what real strength means. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. You know, that night at the restaurant, you could have responded to my prejudice with anger. You had every right to. Instead, you showed compassion. That taught me something important, that change doesn't come from shame or punishment alone. It comes from seeing the humanity in others and then finding it again in yourself. Dr. Thompson watched her leave, noting how different she was from the proud, prejudiced hostess of 3 months ago. As she walked down the hospital corridor, she passed more photos on the wall, more stories, more lives touched and saved. But now she saw them differently. Now she understood that every face had a story, every person had value, and true transformation begins with opening not just doors, but hearts and minds as well.